This week, I'm joined by Mark Regev, Senior Advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister and Israel's former ambassador to the UK. We're speaking on Friday, the 27th of October, 20 days since the war started. Mark, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mark, first of all, what have you made of the debate surrounding the media coverage of this war so far?
So, with your permission, I'll raise a few issues. First of all, I think the use of the word militant has receded, and people are using the correct word terrorist more and more. And maybe that's because of the atrocious violence we saw on October 7th. Yes, you can't say that militants burned people alive. You can't say militants cut people's heads off. You can't say militants shot people in a ravine, yes? And so I think that's something that I've noticed, that even some media outlets that traditionally always just said militants are now using the correct word, sometimes with qualification. But I think that's something that I've noticed in this conflict that wasn't there in the past, maybe precisely because, as I said, the atrocious nature of Hamas's behavior at the beginning of the conflict. One thing, though, hasn't changed. And since this conflict started, I've been hearing numerous reports from people inside Gaza. And I don't think on a single one of them I've heard even a hint of criticism of Hamas. And I think this is one of the structural problems that I don't have a solution to, but I think it needs to be talked about more and more. That Hamas runs Gaza in a very authoritarian way. It's capable of violence, not just against Israelis, but against its own people. And you get all these interviews of people from Gaza, and if no one ever criticizes Hamas, you can presume, one, everyone just loves Hamas, which is obviously an irrational presumption, or that people are very, very careful in what they say to foreign media. And they have the ability, through the authoritarian nature of their rule in Gaza, to enforce a sort of message, the party message. So I must have seen, since this conflict started, hundreds of people, a doctor, a civilian, someone else being interviewed from Gaza, and yet you never hear a word of criticism of Hamas. Why is that? And I think the media needs to think about that. They do the live interviews with someone who's just seen something, or giving a report on a hospital or a school. Why is it you never hear that?
I've got a former colleague in Gaza, and I asked him to interview some people about their true feelings about Hamas, even off the record. And he said it was more than their life was worth. He said even one brother won't confide his real feelings to another brother for fear of reprisals from Hamas.
And so I think the media, they interview people in Gaza, and they present them as telling, we're getting a genuine feeling of what people are saying. But there is I think, a structural problem, a methodological problem. People are fearful of speaking out of turn. So either they won't speak to a foreign journalist, or they parrot the party line, what they think they're expected to give. So it's always an Israeli airstrike. There was never a legitimate military target in the area. They just blew up our home for no reason. Never a criticism of Hamas for starting this round of violence, or of the terrible, atrocious atrocities that they committed against the Israeli public. That's never said by anyone in Gaza. So once again, one can presume that everyone in Gaza believes in Hamas 100%. But the international community is always telling us, no, we have to differentiate between Palestinians and Hamas.
One of the things that I've noticed is that, as you're pointing out, that the Western media seem to believe Hamas in a way that they would never believe Islamic State officials. And the Prime Minister and other people have been very keen to identify the similarities between Hamas and Islamic State, both in terms of their ideological origins, but also in their brutal methods. Do you feel that message is beginning to make any impact at all?
I believe so, but there are still problems. Like all the statistics that come out of Gaza on casualties are all coming out of the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. And so once again, one has to ask, so is there any verification for all these numbers of fatalities coming out of Gaza? Of course not. There's no way of verifying that. We do have one documented case. You'll recall the case of the hospital, where originally Israel was accused of bombing a hospital, and I think they talked about 500, even 800 civilian casualties in that single incident. And this was put out by the Hamas Ministry of Health. But in the end, when obviously it came out that it wasn't Israel, that this was an astray rocket that malfunctioned of Islamic Jihad. But actually, people looked at the crater and they said, well, actually, the explosion wasn't so big, and it's strange that there were so many fatalities. And in the end, I saw a report on the AFP wire service, the quoting European intelligence agencies, saying maybe it was between 15 and 50 people who were killed. Now, let's take the lower number put out by the Hamas Ministry of Health, 500. That's 10%. 10%. And that's just one documented case. In most of the cases, we don't have someone, seriously looking at the case. Now, I've got no doubt that there are people caught up in crossfire. I've got no doubt that there have been civilian casualties, and I'm not trying to push over or cover up that the situation for the civilian population of Gaza is very difficult at this moment. But the sort of numbers coming out of Gaza, I think everyone in the media and in civil society needs to take them with a grain of salt.
Now, Mark, you've served Israel through many conflicts over the years, often making the case on TV, as you're doing now several times a day, at least. How does this conflict and this war compare to your experiences of those you've been involved with in the past?
So first of all, I want to say that what we haven't had in the past is this array of world leaders who've come to Israel to express solidarity. President Biden, the British Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, the French President, the list goes on and on. We had the Prime Minister of Italy, the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, the Prime Minister of Romania, the Prime Minister of Austria, the Chancellor of Austria, I should say, and the phone calls. And I think because of the horrific nature of the Hamas massacre of October 7th, and I mean, we're now 21 days into this, and we're still burying people, and we've still got bodies that are so badly burnt we can't identify them, and we've still got people missing. And we've got over 220 hostages in Gaza. I think the horrific nature of this attack, of the Hamas attack on Israel, has actually, I think, drawn the line in the sand, and people understand. Yes, this isn't Israel against Palestinians. This is Israel, a democracy defending itself against a brutal, ruthless ISIS-type terrorist organization. It doesn't mean that everyone's, applauding everything Israel is doing, but I think there's a fundamental understanding that Israel is responding to an atrocious act of violence. As we've been saying, the attack of October 7th was the largest terrorist attack in real terms since 9/11, and the largest single act of anti-Semitic violence since the Holocaust. And the German Chancellor, his words, not mine, he compared Hamas to the Nazis. And the Americans, not the Israelis, and the other Europeans have compared Hamas to ISIS. And I think that's been a bit of a game changer.
And yet that political support hasn't been reflected necessarily in the public at large. And we've seen protests both in London and other British cities and around the Western world ramping up in recent weeks. There's no sign they're going to decline. Do you feel that will begin to take a toll on the political support that Israel's enjoying at the moment?
It could. I don't know. But I can tell you this, Israel is determined and committed to get the job done. And I mean, and you've referred to this, you've asked me to compare with previous rounds of fighting in Gaza. And you're correct, because since Hamas took over in 2007, and 16 years ago, 2008, there have been several rounds of fighting. But I think it's important for your viewers to understand that Hamas, when they attacked us, this is not just another round of fighting. There's a decision taken in Israel that's it. This is no longer something that we will stand for. There were all these theories, yes, that Israel can live with a Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, that the responsibility that Hamas has of governing 2.3 million people, that forces them to be more responsible, that forces them to be more pragmatic, that forces a moderation of their positions. Ultimately, the fact that they're in government forces them to behave in a more rational, normal way. Well, we saw on October 7th that all those theories are just not true. It's just not true. Hamas doesn't give a hoot about the 2.3 million people inside Gaza. And what we saw in their declaration of war against us is that the status quo, whereby Israel lives next to this ISIS-type terror enclave, is just not sustainable.
Now,
therefore, for the first time, Israel has adopted a policy: we will eliminate Hamas, we will dismantle its military machine, and we will destroy its political power in Gaza.
And that will mean a ground invasion, as the Prime Minister very clearly said just this week. but many people have been surprised at the delay at that ground invasion. We've seen 360,000 reservists called up. The forces have massed. The forces appear to be ready. We've seen a few incursions, but not very many. Can you just outline for our audience what the factors are that might influence the Prime Minister's and the Cabinet's final decision to go in? What's the factors that might influence the timing here?
You know, it's interesting because sometimes the Israelis are depicted, we Israelis are depicted as shooting first and asking questions later, overly quick to go for the draw, so to speak. And I think we're showing in this operation that that's not the case, that we're being very judicious, that we're thinking 2-3 steps ahead, and that when we do go in, and we will, it'll be at a time of our choosing when we think the conditions are optimal for us. Obviously, the safety of the hostages is a primary concern. Obviously, the overall goal of destroying Hamas and of not allowing let's speak frankly, Israelis refuse to return to the reality of 7th of October in the morning. We just refuse to live next to this terror enclave any longer. And we will change the situation in Gaza. So the goals of our operation are more far-reaching than previous operations. Our goal is fundamental change. And I know at some of these demonstrations you alluded to, there have been calls for an immediate ceasefire. And that's what Hamas wants. Of course, Hamas wants an immediate ceasefire because Hamas, attacked us, murdered our people, I should say massacred our people. And then when Israel strikes back, they want a ceasefire. Of course, I mean, that's logical from their perspective. Yes, stop Israel from attacking them, from counterattacking, I should say.
But the factors involved in the timing, people have been talking about the Americans. They've been talking about Iran, Hezbollah. They've been talking about the fact that Hamas is beginning to degrade over time because they're underground. They're using up their fuel and so forth. What do you think are the main factors that will affect the decision?
I think we're just waiting for the best time to do it. I think the factors you say are relevant. Safety of the hostages, coordination with friends and allies. When is the military ready to strike in a way that will surprise them? We've had, as you know, on 2 successive evenings as we speak, we've had serious ground incursions by land forces in and out after destroying targets that we wanted to destroy. But this is a job that has to be done. And I'd also tell you that Israel does this in a way that we know. We fear for the hostages, obviously. We want to avoid civilian casualties on the Israeli side. And we also, I can tell you as the father of an IDF soldier, we also have fears about our young men and women there in the front. And we know that Hamas is a ferocious enemy. We know they're capable of the most terrible violence and committing atrocities. We saw that in the way they acted on October 7th. And they're dug in. They have, as we said a moment ago, they've been there for 16 years. They've built elaborate defenses. One of the hostages, you'll recall, when she got out, one of the 4 out of the over 220, one of the 4 said that it was like a spider web of tunnels under Gaza. And we have to deal with that. And so of course, we don't take the decision lightly. We have to do what we have to do, but we know the dangers involved and the challenges involved in a ground incursion. But, I was speaking to some young soldiers just a moment ago, and they were saying to me, I mean, they know the dangers, but they also know that this is a job that needs to be done. Once again, the bottom line is this: Israel refuses to continue living next to a terror enclave that's capable of committing the sort of violence we saw on October 7th. We refuse to return to the status quo. That is unacceptable for Israelis. The previous status quo of living next to Hamas and just waiting for the next attack, that is unsustainable, and Israelis refuse to accept it any longer.
Now, Mark, but there are 2 status quos at least, aren't there, in Israel? There's the southern status quo with Gaza. There's the northern status quo with Hezbollah, which is a more formidable, larger, and much better equipped and armed and funded fighting force than Hamas. Now that Israel's awoken to the fact that a slumbering monster can awake at any moment, and you can't rely upon speculation about the psychology and, like you say, the pragmatism of terror groups, because once they've got the capability, they can use it. Are the arguments that we've been hearing in Israel that a preemptive strike on Hezbollah or using now that Hezbollah no longer has the element of surprise, are those beginning to carry more weight in Israeli thinking at the moment?
So our policy is victory in the south and deterrence in the north. Now, you're correct in your question that maybe deterrence won't work. We can't be sure that Hezbollah won't attack. So I'd say to you, and through you to Hezbollah, Hamas took us by surprise. It was a mistake by Israel. We'll be looking into exactly what happened to find out why we were surprised. But we won't be surprised in the north. We've mobilized, our forces are ready. And if Hezbollah does attack against us, if they do launch acts of aggression, Israel is ready and waiting, and our response will be swift and formidable. We want deterrence in the north. We're not interested in a conflict, but if Hezbollah does start one, it'll finish on Israel's terms. And you know, the people who lose the most will be the citizens of Lebanon. Over the last decade, that country has suffered tragedy after tragedy. I mean, it's been all over the newspaper. The country's imploding economically, and it's ungovernable, and there are all these issues that the poor Lebanese have had to deal with. Hezbollah, if they launch a war, it'll be a crime against the people of Lebanon, who will have to suffer an Israel-Lebanon war that none of them want. And it'll only happen because Hezbollah is doing the bidding of its Iranian patrons.
So you feel that Israel is able to have a tolerance for the status quo in the north, whereas it doesn't have that tolerance any longer in the south?
Well, Hamas has proven that you can't have a sustainable quiet with them. I mean, that policy was tried and failed dismally. That's the truth. We'll see what Hezbollah is doing. There are people who tell us, we've had meetings with all sorts of foreign leaders over the last week. They all tell us that Hezbollah is more open to hear what people in Lebanon feel. And there's a clear majority of Lebanese who would oppose any escalation. Now, a clear majority of Lebanese don't see a reason to provoke a conflict with Israel. Even in the Lebanese Shia community, there are those who think Hezbollah would be making a tragic mistake if it launched a war against Israel. And so people tell us that Hezbollah, the feelings in Lebanon are so strong against war with Israel that this could contain Hezbollah, even if the Iranians are encouraging them to do the opposite. But we'll have to wait and see. I know we've moved forces to the north. We've taken preparations to the north. We've vacated all the communities close to the Lebanese border. We know that's possible. We're ready. But once again, it won't be, if there is conflict in the north, it's not because Israel wanted it. It's because it was forced upon us by Hezbollah.
Now, Mark, these are obviously very dangerous and perhaps desperate times in some ways for Israel. Has this cause any changes in Israel's rules of engagement? I'm thinking not just of Gaza, but also on the West Bank, where we have seen soldiers responding to stone throwers with live fire aimed towards their legs. That seems like a different set of rules of engagement than we've seen in the past. Is that the case?
I can't refer to the specific incidents. I'm not aware of them, but I can tell you we're at war. In the past, we talked about operations against Hamas in Gaza. Now we say we're at war. And against Hamas activists on the West Bank, we've preemptively been arresting them. There are Hamas cells across the West Bank, and we're not waiting for them to come and attack us. We're arresting them and taking necessary steps now to keep that situation under control. But of course, we have to protect ourselves. Look, you asked a good question before when you asked about Lebanon. Yes, but there's a possibility of problems from the Syrian frontier. There are possibilities of problems on the West Bank. The only thing I could tell your viewers, Israel has fought two front wars in the past, in 1967 and 1973. 73 was difficult for Israel, very difficult. Like this time, we were caught by surprise. But in the end, we prevailed. And though we don't want a two-front war, we're convinced we will win one if we're forced to fight one.
So in terms of the actual rules of engagement that the IDF is employing on the ground, have these, I mean, obviously protecting civilian life continues to be a priority for Israel as for any other democracy. But have the measures been relaxed in terms of the leaflet drops, the text messages, the knock on roof policy with dummy bombs? Have those been relaxed at all to allow the IDF to engage more aggressively in Gaza?
I think we have to engage more aggressively because of the threats that are out there. And so I don't think everything we do is in accordance with international law. But we are acting more aggressively because we're at war.
Okay, and looking at the bigger geopolitical picture with respect to Iran in particular, we have seen quite a slackening of American pressure in the recent 12 months or so towards Iran in terms of relaxing sanctions and so forth. But then in contrast with that, we've seen some American strikes on Iranian assets in Syria over the last 24 hours or so in response to aggression from Syrian-controlled militia in the region. What's your analysis of the chances of regional conflagration drawing in Iran, given the bigger pieces that are at play here?
So I said we want deterrence in a war, and we know that if there is a war in the north, it'll be because Iran wanted one. And here I want to praise the United States. President Biden has been 100% behind us. As you saw, he visited us earlier this week when he came, and he expressed his support for Israel. It's not only the words; it's also his deeds. They're helping us with our stockpiles of weaponry to make sure we have the tools that we need to win the war in Gaza and to deter people in the north. He's also, as you know, moved 2 aircraft carrier groups to the Middle East, deterring, he said, to people who are interested in exploiting the crisis in Gaza for their own nefarious needs. He's told them don't. And I think that American support and that American deterrence is very important. And if there isn't an explosion in the north, it'll be because the Americans have drawn a line in the sand and convinced Israel's other enemies that they should stay out of this one. And I think the recent American strikes against Iranian bases in Syria are a sign that they're saying we're serious about this. Right. And so I hope that in Iran and in Hezbollah people take heed.
So peace in the north, and with regard to Iran holding on out the conflict, depends to some large extent on the Americans.
I think the Americans are sending a message that the Iranians should watch their step, and it's an important message. I think the Iranians will be foolish to try to escalate the situation now, but you never know, and we have to be prepared for it. I think also from your point of view as Brits, America has led, Britain is also leading, and it's interesting, the other Europeans following as well, yes. We've had support from Europe that we're not used to having, and it's good. We're pleased to see it. The American president, by making the comparison with ISIS, has drawn a moral line in the sand, and it's very, very important. And I think other countries have followed. And for Israelis, yes, we're sometimes used to being alone when we're taking on the terrorists. It's gratifying to see the level of international support we are receiving.
Now, one of the strange or sort of secondary effects of the conflict has been to draw together what was previously quite a divided nation, the nation of Israel, politically. It's become Am Echad once again. And I think that we've seen that reflected throughout the diaspora as well, that Jews of all walks of life, from all nationalities, have pulled together in solidarity in any number of ways, spiritually and practically. What do you think is the importance of that to the Israeli war effort, sitting there, wherever you are in Jerusalem? What do you think is the importance of Jewish unity throughout the diaspora with regard to the facts on the ground in the war?
I think it's crucial. And we have to remember the following. When Hamas stormed the border and started butchering our people, they went to left-wing kibbutzim, and they went to Sderot, which is a bastion of Likud, and they killed everyone they found. They don't care how we vote. They don't care if we're left-wing or right-wing, if we're secular or religious. They kill us because we're Israelis, because we're Jews. And I think there was a wake-up call. I mean, we've been very divided politically in Israel over the last couple of months. The whole debate over judicial reform has divided the country. We've had maybe almost unprecedented political polarization in Israel, yes? And we've been arguing passionately about all sorts of issues. But I think in many ways, the brutal atrocities committed by Hamas against our people was a wake-up call. Yes, ultimately, there's much more that unites us than divides us. And this is, the public is, as you said in your question, has united, just as you're telling me diaspora Jewish communities have. I mean, they butchered supporters of Benjamin Netanyahu, and they butchered supporters of Peace Now and everything in between. And diaspora communities know that. The people who yell in the streets of Europe, jihad and so forth, they don't distinguish who you support politically. Yes, the very existence of a Jewish state is for them something that is unacceptable, and they want to kill us. And the manifestations of this has been in the extension of the government. Yes, the party that was in opposition, Benny Gantz's party, I think it's called National Union in English, they've joined the coalition and are in the war cabinet. And I think that reflects the desire of the Israeli people for unity to achieve victory in this war. And when the war is over, we'll have plenty of time for politics again, but we've got to win the war first. Ultimately, there are a whole series of questions that need to be examined. I spoke before about that we didn't get an intelligence warning of that attack on October 7th. Why didn't we get an intelligence warning? Was there something wrong? You know, we pride ourselves in Israel about our very good Mossad and Shin Bet and so forth. Why was there no warning? Why did they surprise us? And secondly, we spent all this time building a fence with all the high tech, and it was supposed to be impenetrable, and yes, they stormed across it. And then there are questions: why did it take so long to remove the terrorists from Israeli territory? Some of the members of the kibbutzim said we were there for 7 hours. Terrorists were walking around their communities until they were thrown out. There are all these questions, and of course, it all filters up to the senior political leadership, right? And Benjamin Netanyahu said just a few days ago, "I am responsible. I also have to be judged." But I think all that is going to wait until the war is over, because we've got to win the war. The focus now is victory. We have to defeat Hamas. We have to destroy Hamas. We have to create a new reality in Gaza. That's the goal. I would just add that destroying Hamas is not just good for the people of Israel, who won't have to live next to this terrorist enclave any longer, but it ultimately, I think, is good for the people of Gaza, who deserve better than this autocratic theocracy that they live under. I mean, they've been impoverished. They've suffered much. They continue to suffer because of that terrible regime, and their lives can only get better after we've changed the political reality in Gaza.
Now, just one last question, Mark. You're a bit more of a personal one. You're Australian-born. Do you ever feel in darker moments that, God, life would just be so much easier if I went back to Australia?
And more boring. But to be serious, yeah, I never think about going back. I mean, I go back to visit. I've got family there. Yes, I've got a mother and siblings in Australia. But no, Israel's my home, and I wouldn't think of leaving. I also think we need perspective, because what we're going through now is very, very difficult. But Israel has faced terrible challenges in the past, and we've overcome, and this country is a great success story. And I'm convinced that we will prevail in dealing with these challenges, and Israel will continue to be an amazing success story. And anyone who feels for Israel, I mean, I immigrated to this country from Australia, as you said rightly, in 1982. So how many years ago is that now? That's quite a while ago, and 41 years ago. And I've not regretted that for a moment. And people who want to immigrate to this country, who want to become Israelis, you should know that life in Israel has its tensions and has its, as we see at the moment. But ultimately, this country is an amazing success story, as we will show and continue to show. And I remain optimistic about the future of this country.
Well, Mark Regev from the Jewish Chronicle offices here, and from Diaspora Jewry on the whole, Kol hakavod u'b'hatzlacha, and Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for speaking to us.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for having me.